Welcome everyone to this episode of Tech Talks. I'm Inba Price. I'm a regulatory correspondent at DL News, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us. Securities and Exchange Commissioner Hester Peirce. You've been appointed as commissioner in 2018, and I think there's been a lot that you must have seen in markets and in crypto markets as well. So just to introduce a little bit, this is a big year, I think, politically. There's so many elections happening around the world, in the EU, in the US, in the UK, and just in France. Over the past few months, we've seen so many of these elections. The US are still going to come up in November. In none of these election campaigns on this side of the Atlantic, over in Europe, have we seen crypto actually be mentioned on the election campaign. I don't think that it's a topic that has really gained much momentum, but yet in the US, in the world's biggest economy, it actually has become a bit of a political issue. Republican candidate and former President Donald Trump, he recently, even this month, the Republican Party said they would try to halt the crypto crackdown in the US. So that's showing that crypto is an issue that people care about, either politicians or the population, or somewhere in between, people care. The US has also been criticized by the crypto industry for not having clear, tailor-made rules that creates a kind of hostile environment where a lot of big companies and small companies are embroiled in legal battles, sometimes also with the SEC. And these legal disputes often come down to whether the platform is handling unregistered securities. On the other hand, the SEC is actually responsible for the crypto bull market of this year by approving exchange-traded funds to track the price of Bitcoin, and that has allowed Wall Street giants and financial institutions to, pile in on crypto. So all that said, there's a lot to talk about with you, Hester. And we will talk about ETFs, we'll talk about litigation, but let's start with talking about elections and legislation. So my first question to you is, what do you expect to see in terms of the government and its agencies working on crypto before and after US elections? What is and of course, Chairman Gary Gensler is kind of, if I may say, a kind of iconic adversary of the industry, but will his role stay or not after these elections? If you could give us a little bit of insights.
Sure. Well, thanks, Inbar. It's great to be with you, and thanks to Mariana as well for making this happen. I do want to start with my disclaimer, which is that my views are my own views as a commissioner, not necessarily those of the SEC or my fellow commissioners. I think that's something that often puzzles people when they hear that disclaimer. They try to understand, what is this agency and how does it work? And so let me just give you a little background that it's a 5-member commission, which is a little bit unusual in the way agencies are structured in the US. And we all make decisions we all vote on every rule that comes out, every enforcement action. It's moves forward by a majority vote. And we are appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, but we have to be politically balanced. So that means you can't have more than 3 people from the president's party, basically. And the president gets to choose the chairman, and the chairman of the agency has an outsized role because he gets to set the agenda, which is pretty important. He gets to manage the staff. So all the staff in the agency, we have about 4,500 people, they all report to him, and he gets to set the budget. So those are big roles. So if you see, typically what you see after a presidential election, if the president changes, typically the chairman of the SEC will also change in response to that. So that's why you sometimes see changes in policy from one presidential administration to another presidential administration. In terms of the landscape more broadly, I mean, you also mentioned, Inbar, the Congress has been involved in issues. There have been, crypto has become a political topic to some extent. It has been helpful from my perspective to see Congress getting involved and thinking about what a good regulatory framework would look like. And so to some extent, the elections also affect that in the sense that whether that gets done, whether the legislation moves forward this Congress or next Congress, it could change depending on what the composition of the Senate and the House look like.
Thank you, Hester. And so would you be able to talk a little bit about what a Democrat win would mean for the kind of work and policy on crypto compared to a Republican win in November?
Yeah, it's really hard for me to say what the difference would be. I mean, I think we know that we're in the Biden administration now, and you can see what the crypto policies have been. And then, we don't know what crypto policies look like under a different administration. That said, I think it's also really important to underscore that the SEC is an independent regulatory agency. So it's a little bit different than some other agencies which directly report to the president. It gives us a little bit more, I guess I would say political independence.
And would you be able to say what kind of impact the different election results would mean for the SEC and the work the SEC does when it comes to crypto assets?
I mean, again, it depends a great deal because the chairman of the agency does have quite a bit of power to set what the agenda is, and because the staff are reporting to him and budget decisions are made by the chairman, it really does matter who the chairman is. Now, I obviously weigh in on those kinds of things. I give Chair Gensler my suggestions about what to do and what not to do. Whether those get taken is it's up to the chairman. And so it's really difficult to predict what will happen depending on where the election comes out.
And who is eligible to be the next Gary Gensler?
Oh, it could be anyone. The president really has wide latitude. Sometimes the president has chosen a lawyer. Sometimes the president has chosen someone who has experience in the securities industry. So it varies a lot.
I can imagine. So we'll have to wait and see if that comes to fruition.
Inbar, one other thing I should underscore, I think sometimes people look at the SEC and they think, oh, the SEC just does crypto. In reality, there are a lot of other issues on our plate. And so when people talk about, what is the SEC chairman's agenda, it's often driven by things that are totally unrelated to crypto. And I think that's important to underscore.
And I guess when it comes to talking about the two parties, we had a quite rare occurrence this year where on the Financial Innovation Technology Bill for the 21st century, or FIT21 for short, that bill actually got bipartisan support in the House of Representatives. So this bill actually delegates some regulation oversight to the SEC, and that splits it between the Commodities Futures Trading Commission as well, depending on the level of decentralization of an asset, among other criteria. So I think we'll have to see where this bill goes, if it succeeds to make its way through the Senate, and past the hurdles that elections might put forward as well. But how would you comment on this kind of support that you're seeing in Congress? Of course, your comments can't be too political, but it'd be interesting to hear your take on what you think this means for the industry.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to see that Congress is spending some time thinking about where they would like to have the regulatory authority lie. The US is a little bit different from a lot of other jurisdictions in that we have an SEC and also the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, as you mentioned. Typically, for many other jurisdictions, those two regulatory functions would be in the same body. And so because we have that bifurcation of responsibility, it means that Congress really has to think about who should be responsible for what. And so often our jurisdictions are bumping up against each other. And maybe we think something is in our jurisdiction, the CFTC thinks it's in its jurisdiction. And so sometimes Congress has to come in and say, okay, this is how we want to allocate responsibility. So, at the SEC, we're happy to do whatever it is Congress wants us to do, whatever role they want us to play. whether it's a more limited role or a more expansive role, we're happy to take that on. I think it's important that whatever we do now is able to accommodate whatever crypto becomes, because I think we often just think of crypto as being a very financially centered asset class, but in reality, there's a lot going on in crypto that has nothing to do with the financial markets at all. And so whatever we do, we have to make sure it accommodates that. I mean, I'm thinking things like decentralized physical infrastructure, that doesn't necessarily fit neatly within a financial framework. So Congress has a very hard task when they try to set this framework up.
And when it comes to the collaboration or maybe even rivalry between the CFTC and the SEC, how do you see the two agencies working together, and especially, you know, keeping in mind crypto as not the main issue, but an issue?
Yeah, and I don't think of it as being a rivalry, and I think it's sometimes we need to step back and remember that we both serve the American people, we serve the American markets, and so we should really be thinking about who is better suited to do X function or Y function, of course, as Congress has directed us. So that's kind of what I'm thinking of, and I've had experience working with the CFTC. When Commissioner Brian Quintenz, who's now fairly engaged in the crypto industry, but when he was at the CFTC, he and I worked together to implement a regulatory regime for security-based swaps. So the CFTC regulates swaps, we regulate security-based swaps, which are sort of sister products. And the two of us tried to work together to make sure that that framework was as aligned as possible. And I think that experience, the two agencies, apart from Brian and me, had worked on this issue since Dodd-Frank post-financial crisis legislation. So that history, I think, has been helpful. There have been periods in our working relationship that have been better and worse, where, you know, we've sometimes had our issues with each other, but we've also figured out how to work through issues. And I think we could apply that same kind of approach here to crypto. And in fact, there are CFTC commissioners who I have talked to, and they're very open to the idea of working together. So I think this is not, it's not unprecedented, and it's certainly not impossible for us to work together.
Thank you for explaining all the, you know, nooks and crannies of US financial regulation. And something else which was interesting recently is that you actually proposed a decentralized ledger technology, or DLT, sandbox project, and you were hoping this would actually bring the US and the UK to collaborate on this DLT sandbox. So could you maybe explain what you were hoping to achieve with this proposal and what would actually need to happen for that to become a reality?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking about that. The UK has a digital securities sandbox project that they're undertaking, and they put out a request for comment. And so I responded to that to say, hey, why don't you try to think of a sandbox that would work in the UK and the US together, so that a firm could be experimenting in both jurisdictions at the same time. That would require some adjustments on their end. It would also require some work on our end. We would, as I proposed, we would set up a micro innovation sandbox that would allow people to come in and say, I am doing this in the UK using these conditions. I'm going to do the same thing in the US pursuant to the same conditions that I'm using in the UK. And so then people would be able to experiment here in the US. So the idea is it could plug and play with the UK's regime, but it could also work with any other jurisdiction's regime, because what you do is you'd come in with whatever conditions you wanted, and you could then experiment in the US under, you know, we'd have thresholds, dollar thresholds and customer thresholds. What this is really a response to is this notion that a lot of people make fun of now, right? Which is the come in and register with us at the SEC. A lot of people have heard that and they've said, we've tried to come in and talk to you and we're not getting anywhere. We get in these conversations that last for years. We never get out the other side with anything other than perhaps an enforcement action. So is there a more productive way forward? And I think what we need to do is have the ability for people to come in, structure a small scale experiment, show the SEC that it's working, and then work toward permanent relief. But it allows the project to actually get started right away without having to get a green light from the SEC. I've just proposed this. It's just me. It's not the commission as a whole, so it's not there. But I think it's important to underscore that having ideas like this on the shelf, ready to go, if there is a change of heart at the SEC, could really jumpstart things, get things moving in the US. And so that's really what I'm trying to suggest, whether it's my micro innovation sandbox or if someone else has a better idea. Let's get those ideas out there. Let's discuss them. I recently got, because I had asked people to respond and critique the proposal, and I recently got a critique from someone, which is very helpful, suggestions of how I can make it more effective. And so I welcome people to give me those kinds of suggestions.
And regarding the sandbox, do you take any lessons from maybe the EU's approach to a DLT regime and the pilot regime, or do you imagine maybe that a project like this could expand to other jurisdictions beyond these
Yeah,
two?
absolutely. Yeah, you could come in if you were doing something in the EU and you wanted to try the same thing in the US. You could take the conditions that you're adhering to in the EU and just start doing that in the US as well. So the idea is it could kind of plug and play with any different jurisdiction that someone wanted it to work with. Now, it would be helpful if there were an information sharing agreement between the two jurisdictions so that regulators in both jurisdictions could see the activity in both. But I think that's something that would be doable with the EU or with the UK.
And when it comes to DeFi regulation, the Securities and Exchange Commission has reconsidered the definition of exchange, and that would, in a way, implicate DeFi and decentralized finance. This came under a proposal from the SEC, and last year you publicly dissented this proposal. Could you maybe explain a little bit more about the proposal, what the expanded definition of exchange would mean for DeFi, and why you were against it and actually went against what your colleagues had proposed?
Yeah, so the definition of exchange, you typically think of it as a place where people come to trade securities. Here, it was expanding it, so it's just expressions of interest, basically. So it's a much broader definition, not only with respect to crypto, but with respect to lots of any other kind of asset that we're treating as a security. And so when we first put this proposal out, I said, hey, this sounds like it might have an effect on crypto. And a lot of people wrote in and said, yeah, we think if it went into effect, it would indeed have an effect on crypto. And so we put out a new request for comment where we really did think about how it would affect crypto. And when I looked at that, I said, what this sounds like is it's saying to decentralized projects, you either have to centralize so that there is someone who can register as an exchange, or you have to shut down, or you have to get out of the US and cut off US participation. So I think the consequences, if this were to go into effect, would be pretty severe. Now, the other piece of that is that even under the existing definition of exchange, there are questions about how it interacts with decentralized projects. And again, I think we have to have a real conversation about this. I think people in the crypto world really need to be thinking about this as well. I really resist anything that would say the goal is to get things centralized and registered, because I think that completely undermines one of the benefits of a decentralized model, which really allows people to participate on terms that are easily, everyone gets the same terms, they're transparent, and people can choose whether to interact or not on those terms, but they know what they're getting. Forcing centralization, I think, defeats the purpose. So we'll see where this proposal goes. It still is just a proposal. But I think even under the existing definition of exchange, how the SEC ultimately interprets how that interacts with decentralized finance is a big question.
So I have two follow-up questions. First of all, you said that we have to see where this proposal goes. What are the options? Where could it go?
So one thing that could happen is we could just adopt it as proposed. Another thing that could happen is, and there were a lot of people inside and outside the crypto world who wrote comments in and expressed concerns. But another option would be that we could adopt a modified version in response, make some changes in response to commenters. Or if we wanted to go a pretty different direction, we could come out with yet another proposal to say, hey, here's what we're thinking of doing. So there are a lot of different options out there.
And the second question is, of course, your response here was public, so everyone knew what you had to say about this definition of exchange and what it means for DeFi. How did your colleagues respond on one hand, and how did the industry respond on the other?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the things that came up in the discussions was who actually has to if we're saying decentralized protocols have to register, who are we actually asking to register? And so I think that this is an issue that really we have to grapple with more. And I think that has come out, even at the meeting where we discussed the issue. I think that question really sort of hangs out there. And one of my big concerns is that, are we going to get to a place where we're requiring coders to register with us just because they're writing code? That I think is really problematic for many reasons. We don't want to have to be pre-approving people's code. And I think we really need to grapple with the fact that when someone develops code and puts it out there, it's out there and it can operate. It doesn't require anyone to operate it. So what do we do about that? And I think it's those kind of conversations that we need to have, but we need to have them not only within the building, but with people outside the building who are actually developing decentralized things so that we can get their input on what makes sense in terms of regulation.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting topic, especially with cases such as Tornado Cash that have come up both in Europe and in the US with ongoing trials. So yeah, I think it's a moment where a new technology meets existing regulation, and sometimes there's friction when the two of those meet.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think society at times like that has to have a frank conversation about what do we want? And different people value different things. And that's why we have to have those open conversations about it. I really value the ability of people to, be able to develop these kinds of things and be able to try things. But it does run into, it's much more difficult to regulate something like that. Yet at the same time, the technology has aspects that make it easier to regulate because you can see what's going on in a very transparent way. So or maybe the technology substitutes for regulation in some ways. And that's what I want people to be open to, is this idea that we don't have to just look at the things that make it more difficult to regulate. We can think about what aspects of the technology actually might displace the need for regulation.
So I want to ask you about another interesting thing that happened recently, and that's the overturn of the Chevron doctrine. And to explain that this is a doctrine that's been applicable over the past 40 or so years, and it says that if there's an ambiguity in the law, the court will defer to an expert agency like the SEC, for example, to that agency's interpretation. So now that is out of the door, and that means that now when a court is going to decide what the interpretation is. They won't defer to the agency's final say. So I understand that you're still processing what all of this means, but any comments about where you think that will leave the SEC when it comes to regulation and lawmaking?
Yeah, we really are still processing it. I think one just basic principle for all agencies to follow is Congress gets to tell us what to do, and we have to try to hew closely to what Congress told us to do. That's a good principle, regardless of what the canons of interpretation are at the Supreme Court. And so that's really what I'm paying most attention to is let's make sure when we look at our statutory authority that we're sticking to it, and that we're not trying to adopt interpretations that are overly aggressive, right? We really need to just do what Congress told us to do. And anything that reminds us to do that, I think is helpful.
I see. And so I want to talk a little bit about litigation. So many companies in the US are being sued, or they're embroiled in some lawsuits with various agencies, including the SEC. So among them are Ripple, Kraken, Coinbase, Binance is also ongoing. So what is the process like? How do you decide who to litigate and when? Can you unpack this black box for us?
Yeah, it is a little bit confusing, I think, to people outside to see how that works. So I don't want to speak about any particular case, but just generically, I will say, and I've said this before, I think our approach of using enforcement as our leading foot in crypto regulatory policy is a mistake, because I think it's a really, if you're going to try to use enforcement to set the rules, it's just very inefficient. It's much more efficient to write a rule and then people can adhere to it. And when people don't adhere to it, you can concentrate your enforcement resources there. You can concentrate them on the, unfortunately, many bad actors in the crypto space, or who are purporting to be crypto in the crypto space, but are actually just running away with people's money. So that said, how it typically works is, so we have a pretty large staff, and a big portion of that staff are enforcement attorneys. And so they are looking at activity all across our markets. We have a specific unit that deals with crypto and cyber violations, securities violations. So they might spot something, whether it's, we get lots of tips coming in. If anyone sees bad activity that looks like it's a securities violation, you can go to our website, you can file a tip complaint or referral. And if we actually end up bringing a case, you might even get an award for doing that. So we get a lot of whistleblowers coming in and telling us about things, or people might just, because they know what the landscape is, they might see something and look into it. And then we will get, so the staff investigates. If it decides it's going to charge someone, typically what it will do is it puts out a Wells notice, something called a Wells notice, which a lot of people in the crypto world have now heard of. The person who may be sued, or the company who may be sued, can then put in a Wells submission, a response saying, here's why you shouldn't sue me. And then if the staff decides to move forward with a recommendation, they come to the commission, they say, this is who we'd like to sue. Sometimes they come not only with a recommendation to sue, but with a settlement agreement that they've negotiated. And so then we see we both authorize the suit and vote then on the settlement at the same time. So then we look at the documents, we look at if the party made a Wells submission, we look at that, and we look at the recommendation from the staff, and then we vote on it. Those votes happen not in the public eye. We have something called a closed meeting where we vote on enforcement matters, and we can discuss them with one another, and then we have a vote on those. So that's how the process typically works. I will say that most of our enforcement actions end up being settled either immediately, as you know, as I said, when we authorize it, we actually also have the settlement, or very shortly thereafter. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but one is it's pretty expensive to litigate. So you can understand why that might happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for sharing those details. I mean, knowing that a lot of crypto firms are going through this is interesting to take into consideration. Are there maybe any lessons you can share from places which are already closed? For example, Stoner Cats or LBRY, I believe those cases have already been closed. So do you take any lessons from how that process went when you litigate other companies?
Yeah, I mean, I think both of those cases illustrate for me, I think somewhat the arbitrariness of, again, because we have limited enforcement resources, you're going to not be able to go after every project, right? So you make a decision. And I thought, for example, the LBRY case was one of the really low moments for me as a commissioner, because that was a project. And again, it's not my job as a regulator to decide whether something has merit or not. But that was a project where there was really substantial work that had been done. And we nevertheless decided to litigate, and we ended up basically shutting it down. And that for me seemed, there were no allegations of fraud. It was a registration violation. That seemed to me problematic. And then, you know, the Stoner Cats case, I think, is an example of where that was an NFT case. I think if we had applied similar logic in other contexts, we could be bringing cases against all kinds of non-digital collectible issuers. So I think what both cases tell me is we'd really be better off spending some of the resources that we spend on litigating those kinds of cases in trying to draw some lines for people to say, okay, if you're developing an NFT, here are some of the things you might want to think about in terms of whether or not it bumps up against the securities laws. Similarly, if you're developing a project where you're going to use a token as sort of the currency of the realm, here are some of the things you might want to think about. I think one of the frustrations that people have is when they have questions about wanting to develop something and wanting not to run afoul of the securities laws, they often feel that they can't come to the SEC and have that conversation. We're never going to be your lawyer for you. We're never going to say, okay, we're going to do the legal work. But I think what both of those cases illustrate is that it's very difficult for people just to have a conversation with us and get some help thinking through the issues. And then more generally, that there's this real hunger for guidance, for generalized guidance. And we could have put it out, and I think it would have helped both of those projects as well as many others.
Really interesting to hear those reflections. I wanted to ask also about ETFs. You know, exchange traded funds have been such a hot topic for crypto markets. In January, about a dozen financial institutions had the green light to start trading these ETFs for spot Bitcoin ETFs. So Ethereum ETFs are next on the menu. That's partially been approved, but what can we expect next when it comes to Ethereum ETFs?
So I think Chair Gensler has said that we're working them through. It will take, you know, probably summer. We don't know, right? Because it depends on how issuers respond and how they're working now with our Division of Corporation Finance to get the disclosures right. And so that process really does depend on how quickly people respond to the comments that our staff makes. And our staff is basically trying to get the disclosures to a place where they feel that their investors clearly will understand what they're getting. And so that process is ongoing now. And I think it's actively, there's active back and forth. And so I think we can expect that there will be forward movement sometime soon.
And other than disclosures, what else is kind of the criteria to get an approval from the SEC?
Yeah, I mean, so we have the two processes, which I think is the 19B4 process, the process where the exchange that's going to list a product has to come in and get approval. That's run through one division of the SEC, and then we have the process that's ongoing now, where the Division of Corporation Finance is looking at the disclosures about the products. So that's how it works. In neither instance is our job to be a merit regulator. So we're not looking at these disclosures to say, yeah, we think this is a good product and this one is not a good product. It's really a question of, does it meet the criteria that we've been asked by Congress to implement? And those criteria they're really not about deciding whether a product is good or bad. I think that's so important to underscore, because a lot of people, when they see an approval from the SEC, when they see a green light from the SEC, they take that and they wave it around and they say, well, this means the SEC says this is a product that's safe and that, people should invest. Well, as investors, have different risk tolerances, different things they're looking for. Their portfolios are different. Their time horizons are different. You have to look individually to make a decision about whether a product is good for you or not. And so, we as a securities regulator are not a merit regulator. So it really is just the question of, does it meet the technical requirements on the side for the exchange? And then on the disclosure side, we're really looking to make sure that the picture being presented is an accurate picture of what someone is getting when someone buys one of these products.
And I think there's a lot of talk also about a Solana ETF. So I understand there's been an application already. What do you think about ETFs for other tokens?
So as you say, there has been at least one application that's been filed. And so I don't want to speak specifically to a Solana exchange traded product. As I've said in the past, I think we should just apply the same rules that we've applied with respect to other kinds of products. And this was really my great frustration with the Bitcoin exchange traded product saga, because we went for 10 years, back and forth. People would come in, we'd say, no, what you've provided us isn't good enough. And then the goalposts are moving. People are trying to figure out what to do. And then finally, the court came and said to us, you can't do that. That's arbitrary. And so I think what we need to do is we need to just apply the same rules that we've applied for other things and look at the facts and circumstances of each application. And that means that every application that we get is I can't give you a broad rule. I can just say that we'll look at every application, and I hope we'll just apply the rules as we would apply them to any other kind of non-crypto product.
Thanks for the explanation. I actually have a more personal question for you now as well. When was the first time you heard about Bitcoin, and was there something that caught your interest when you first heard about it?
Yeah, I first heard about it when I was working with some colleagues, probably about 2012, 2013, who were very interested in Bitcoin.
That's really
And
early.
it is early. Yeah, well, it's not as early as I guess it could have been, but it was interesting to me to hear about it. They were very passionate about Bitcoin and about not only Bitcoin, but about the fact that Bitcoin was one of what was likely to be many different approaches to thinking about a non-sovereign form of value, of exchanging and storing value. And so for me, I'm always interested when I hear about people thinking about things in a new way, and I really was drawn to the idea that people were thinking about solving this problem of, you can transfer data over the internet, but how do you transfer value over the internet? That's a really powerful thing to be able to do. And then decoupling money from the state, from a government, is also an interesting idea. So I was drawn to both of those kinds of things and was interested in learning more about it.
And did you ever expect to be nicknamed Crypto Mom?
Certainly not. And I will say, I think it's funny, but at the same time, I do take a little bit of an issue with the term mom. And I think it's important for me to do this. And this ties back to what I was saying before. I'm not your mom. And I believe in people having great freedom in all areas of their life. I think that's really one of my defining, it's one of my guiding principles, is that I really believe the dignity of every human being is tied to, or it should be reflected in freedom, right? And so giving people freedom is a recognition of their dignity as human beings. It's saying, I think you as an individual can make choices for you and your family better than anyone else, because you know your circumstances the best, you know your dreams the best. And too often we as regulators jump in and say, no, I'm your mom, I'm going to tell you what to do with your life. And I really want to back off that and say, no, I want you as an individual to embrace your dignity as a human being, to embrace your freedom of thought, your freedom of action. But with that comes responsibility too. When something goes wrong, don't come running to me as your mom. I'm not going to be there to solve all your problems. I'm going to tell you something bad happened to you. Now let's see if you can learn from that and do better next time. It's not to say that government doesn't have a role. We do have a role. I think we've played an important role in going after people who have tried to defraud others. We set broad parameters within which the markets work, and I think that's an appropriate role to play. But ultimately, we're not going to be the ones to, to dictate how you live your life. One concern that I have is that sometimes things go bad, and people are all about freedom until things go wrong, and then they come to me and say, well, SEC, where were you? Why didn't you prevent me from getting hurt? And I think you can't have it both ways. You need to really recognize that you can have a regulator that has a role, an anti-fraud role, but that doesn't mean the regulator is going to tell you which products are good for you or not good for you. Those are decisions you have to make yourself. And so it's that balance. And that's why, long answer to your question about being Crypto Mom, I don't mind being called Crypto Mom, but I really want people to think about what they're doing and make wise decisions for themselves, and recognize that that is an expression of their dignity as a human being.
We'll have to get a better nickname. And for my last question for you, it's your last, stretch as commissioner since you were appointed. What would you say is your biggest achievement, and what do you still hope to accomplish in the time that's left?
Well, the work of the commission is really collective. It's not it's not an individualized task, right? I'm one of 5 commissioners, but as I said, we have a really big staff, and those staff are working hard every day. And so a commissioner has a role to play. And I think my role, among other things, is to really think carefully about every one of these decisions that I make, whether it's a rulemaking or an enforcement action. And so, and to put a critical eye on everything, right? That's the reason we have 5 of us here, is that each of us can take our own experiences and our own approach to thinking about things and really ask questions. And so that's something that I do a lot of. I ask a lot of questions. And I think it's also really important for people who are out there looking at the regulator to see that there are people who at the regulator who do care about their ability to do with their lives what they want to do. And so I think I've been a little bit of a voice for people who have been frustrated with how the SEC has approached issues like crypto. And so I've tried to at least nudge the SEC forward on thinking about new ways to approach innovation generally, not just with respect to crypto, but more generally. And then to really think about, every time we're adopting a regulation, to think about does it make sense for us to get involved in this transaction? Or will we just complicate things and make things worse? Like, will we actually have a positive result, or will we make things worse and more likely to have problems? And so I think I've been a little bit of that kind of voice. In terms of what I'd like to accomplish, I mean, I would love to see the SEC turn a corner to a more productive relationship with the crypto industry, for example. And it's not just the industry. I mean, it really just is with to be more productive to people who are trying to do new and interesting things, to be able to come in and really have that productive conversation with us. I'm not going to make an assessment of where crypto or any other technology is going to go, but I don't want the SEC to be the reason that people can't build stuff here in the US. I want the SEC to be playing a productive role, writing rules that make sense, and not something that people are thinking about every day. I want people to be able to think about the technology. And so if we can turn that corner while I'm still here, I would be really excited.
Esther, thank you so much for sharing all these insights and all the different facets of your work at the SEC. I think, we don't get to hear these kind of details very often, so it's a huge privilege. Thank you so much. And I also want to thank Mariana Della Roche for, organizing this this conversation alongside ValidVent and DL News. So thanks so much for dialing in. We have a room full of people here in Brussels who, do you want to see the
I'd love to see, yeah.
Try not break something. Everybody wave. Thank you so much.
Nice to see all of you, and thank you, Inbar. And my door is always open, so feel free to reach out, Commissioner Peirce at sec.gov.
Thank you and have a wonderful evening.
You as well. Take care.
Bye-bye.